Tomer Devorah, and we're up to page Lamed Vav. So before we get started, just get Scott in the loop. The Tomer Devorah was written by somebody named Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, and he's usually referred to by the acronym Ramak, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero. You might have heard of Ramak.
Yeah, in San Diego, there's an ancestor of his, actually.
Very good.
Yeah.
How did you know that?
Know the person.
Is that right?
Yeah.
The Ramak. So the Rabbi Moshe Cordovero lived in the land of Israel. He lived in Sfat, in the golden age of Sfat, around the time of the Rav Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch and all of the mystics for which Sfat is very well known. And the Rabbi Moshe Cordovero was one of them. He wrote many works on both the revealed and the hidden, more esoteric topics in Torah, his being a Kabbalist. And one of the major ones was called Pardes Ramonim. It's a real classic on Jewish Kabbalah. But this, as you see from the size, is a small work, although it's very dense. And the basically intention of the Ramak here is to introduce us to some Kabbalistic principles regarding two general areas, and then translate those ideas into kind of a guide for improving our practical daily living. The book is therefore divided into these two areas. The first one is what we refer to as the 13 attributes of divine mercy, which we have concluded. And the second part is dedicated to the 10 spheros, which we've talked a lot about, the 10 spheros, in conjunction with what was said about the 13 attributes as well. But this part of the book is going through these 10 spheros in order. The first one being the sphere of Keter. Okay, Keter means crown. Are you familiar with the notion of sphera? Have you?
Yeah, I've heard of it
Yeah.
before.
So I'll try and elaborate on that a little bit as we go along. But the rest of part of the book is basically dedicated to going through these spheros, these 10 spheros, one by one on a deeper level, and then, like I said, translating into kind of advice for improving our daily living. We're towards the end of the first one, Keser. We'll be moving shortly into the others. But let's suffice it to say, because we have really gone into some depth about this, for the time being, that the general notion of the spheros is that God, being absolutely infinite, would preclude the possibility of anything existing in the presence of God. By definition of God's absolute infinity, nothing else other than God can exist. Anything that would exist would immediately implode back into that infinity and not exist as a separate entity on its own at all. And therefore, part of Kabbalah is, referring to the area what we call Maaseh Breshis, is explaining how it is that God, despite the intensity of his absolute infinity, nevertheless was, quote-unquote, able to create something that seems at least to be physical and finite and separate than itself. And a major kind of component of that explanation is the spheros. And the spheros can be understood, therefore, in that light as being kind of spiritual prisms through which divine energy is refracted, thereby limited, and thereby projected onto a realm that comes into being through the projection of that light. Talking about film, in this way, all of reality, not just, of course, planet Earth, but all of existence, from the greatest expanse of the universe, from one side to the other, even if it's expanding, even if it's dynamic, but at any given moment, physical existence is finite, and therefore, on the one hand, at least seemingly separate from the infinite, but a projection from a projective of light and energy from the realm of the divine into what becomes the apparent realm of creation, and that's what the spheros do. Spheros are like the spiritual film through which that white light is directed and then projected onto a plane, which becomes the scene for what we perceive as a three-dimensional separate reality, when in truth it's really light and energy in a different form. And is that something that's mentioned in film theory? I imagine so.
Some of it, yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
Yeah. So, and we're drawn and we're drawn into that drama through the apparent reality that energy and that light seems to take on. And that's creation. So that these spheros are therefore like prisms or filters through which divine light for creation is limited, projected, directed in order to create. And each sphere then is almost like its little separate, part of the spectrum of refracted divine energy, and therefore has its own color, its own hue, its own kind of essence, which we describe usually as an attribute or a faculty. The higher ones are more like faculties, the lower ones are more like attributes. The highest of them, which is considered to be the most all-inclusive of them, is what we refer to as Keter, or the crown. Within Keter, you have all of the other lower spheros in potential, but existing harmoniously and in united fluid form within that upper sphere of Keter. And Keter is described in this part of the book as being, on the one hand, very elevated, but attaining that elevation specifically through humility. And the reason is that something which empties itself of itself, or to the extent to which something empties itself of its sense of self, it's to that extent which it can become filled with the divine. But something which asserts itself necessarily excludes, as it were, God. And therefore, something which asserts itself and intending to achieve, let's say, elevation through asserting itself, is really limiting itself to a physical, finite, almost human limitation, where something which empties itself of itself enables itself to become full with the divine and therefore is elevated accordingly. So the moment anything would become aware of self and how elevated it's become because of its nothingness, it would actually lose that very elevation, be plummeted back down into somethingness. And therefore, this kind of elevation is dependent constantly on a negation of the sense of self in order to maintain entirely, or to the great extent possible, an infusion of godliness. But the moment that something becomes aware of the extent to which it's infused with godliness, it then gains self-awareness, which precludes the presence of God there. But this is Keter then. Keter is that extreme example of humility, which simultaneously gives it its elevation and enables it to contain within it everything because it's being nothingless, or nothing-some. I don't know exactly how to put it. Yeah, these are the types of qualities of Keter. So again, without going into too much detail, that opened up a whole discussion about different manifestations of the aspect of humility, which one can learn and bring down from Keter into one's daily life. That's kind of a brief summary of where we are. We'll talk about more as we go. But this brings us up to page Lamed Vav, the first full paragraph at the bottom, starting with the word Umnam. Umnam yadanu she'i efshar lisneheg be'elu amidos tomid. We know that certainly a person cannot act with this extreme form of humility always, where he's so devoid of the sense of self, so connected with godliness, that the person only thinks and sees and smells and speaks and hears positivity, purity, holistic resonance with the energy of God. That's something which is ideal, but it's not something which is real for most people to attain most of the time. And the reason for this is because a person is also challenged with other midos, other attributes that he also has to perfect himself through. And these would be the spheros which are included within Keter, but just as in Keter, they are brought into fruition and realized practically through creation, so too in a person's daily life, practically, he's going to have to bring from the potential into the real the different aspects within Keter, which are the lower spheros as well. Right? Because God could have left everything in Keter. God could have not created Keter at all. God could have just been only God with nothing else whatsoever. But God had a plan to create, and that took place through this kind of process of reduction of divine energy, which is called Tzimtzum in Jewish mystical thought, Tzimtzum. And that involves Keter being brought from potential into fruition practically through the other midos, the other spheres as well. And since we are products of creation, and since that creation was projected upon us, and we are kind of the pinnacle of that projection, so it's necessary that we also express those different qualities or hues or colors that are existent within Keter. We spoke about, for example, in the previous section, how in Keter, in that realm of elevated humility and purity and loving kindness, there's no room for judgment. There's no room for din. What is din? Judgment in terms of discerning right from wrong, or reward from punishment. Yet we find in the world there is din, right? There is punishment there, and a person is held accountable for right or wrong deeds, for morally correct or morally incorrect actions. And how can this be? If everything comes from Keter, and Keter is unadulterated loving kindness, so how can, from within that, there exists what we call din, or judgment? And we spoke, we addressed how, in its source, even anything having to do with din, judgment, comes from chesed, comes from rachamim. It comes from God's loving kindness. And therefore, right, if God's will is that creation should earn a closeness to God, that earning has to be something which is deserved. So the deserving of it is something which has to be ascertained, which involves a judgment that has to take place. Ultimately, therefore, judgment is serving the good of God sharing his greatness with creation. Or if, for example, a person chooses through free will, which is also associated with the purpose of earning creation, through his free will he chooses some impurity, some wrong. So that has to be corrected. And that would be corrected through the exercising of din, of judgment. But ultimately it's not spiteful to punish, it's to purify. And therefore, right, in that light, even din is part of chesed and rachamim. And so therefore, the other things that we do in life, the types of spheres of activity within which we operate, or the spheres of character traits within which we operate, they all come from Keter. But they have to be realized in this world. They're part of the kaleidoscope of activity in this world. And therefore, a person cannot always act in pure, unadulterated humility of Keter. But rather, he's got to bring into fruition the other attributes that are included in Keter and which are intended for activity in this world. Vehen mihagvuras hatachtonos, and these other attributes are like the lower judgments. It means it's like those colors of the spectrum that are refracted from the white light into their component parts. And insofar as they are differentiated from that cohesive one whole of divine energy going through Keter, there is some judgment, there is some segmentation that takes place. That segmentation, that compartmentalization, that's part of din. That's part of tzimtzum, right? It's taking that kind of clear, fluid, unadulterated divine energy and dividing it into parts. The division into parts is tzimtzum. That's reduction. Tzimtzum is making something small, smaller than its source of origin. That's associated with din. So in a way, all of the spheros, even if it's right, chokhmah and bina and das or chesed, gvura, tiferes, netzach, whether on the right or the left or the central, they're all, in a way, tzimtzumim. Right? As great as they are tzimtzumim. And all of these midos, therefore, become compartmentalized so that we can say, this is an act of chesed. This is an act of din. Even though that din really has its origin in chesed. But in its manifested form, it takes on a separate, so almost independent identity of din. And the same thing can be said for all the different spheres as well. And that's what we're going to explain and elaborate on as we go along, the author says. And he's referring to the latter, after this chapter, the latter part of the book, where he goes chapter by chapter, sphere by sphere. But in the meantime, he goes into somewhat of an interlude. But there are certain times when these tzimtzumim, these dinim, these judgments are not operative. And people don't need them. They don't need to use them. I'll give you an example. A person arguably should be theoretically constantly connected to God and to godliness and be an entirely whatever we would perceive as being a spiritual, ethereal person who's living, what we would describe as some type of, mystical, esoteric existence, constantly involved in the very highest planes of spirituality. But the reality of the situation is that if a person doesn't do that, if a person does that, more often than not, he's not going to have food to put in his mouth. And if he doesn't have food to put in his own mouth, he's certainly not going to be able to put food in the mouths of people who might be reliant on him, like a spouse or children. So such a person would choose perhaps even not to get married and not to have children, or not to be burdened with that. It's enough to have to disconnect to support himself, but to disconnect to support a family, why should he do that? But you see, so that's not the way God, in Judaism, at least in Jewish teachings, intended a person to live his life, which means that a person is required to undergo, a tzimtzum, which means to undergo, which for most people would be a form of disconnect. I have to be part of this worldly affairs, to work, earn a living, take care of other material needs, clothing or shelter, whatever the case may be. Now it's true, of course, Judaism teaches that even when a person does that, he should be infusing those activities as much as possible with higher spiritual pursuits. And if he's able to do that, that's actually considered to be a very high state of spiritual living. Somebody mentioned here the other day, and I didn't have a chance to comment on it, was something about how, the kind of advantage of living a kind of mystical, even monastic lifestyle, which would enable a person to attain very great spiritual heights. I think somebody mentioned, maybe religions of the Far East and so forth and so on. But somebody once shared with me an idea, somebody who used to teach here in the yeshiva, that one of his students told him that there was a certain, I suppose, a sect, a group of in Hinduism, where people would separate themselves from the community and go up into the mountains, into the beauty and the grandeur of nature, and work very hard in gaining a meditative technique where they were able to stand on one foot under the rushing flow of cold water pouring over them from a waterfall. And the longer they could stand meditating on one foot, despite the onrush of this flow of water over his head, maintain that kind of connection. This was considered to be a great feat, a great height, a great, attainment of self-control and mastery. And all of that is true. But the person asked the rabbi, is there nothing like that in Judaism? So the rabbi said, yeah, it's called getting married, having a wife, and having children, and having to support them, and having to teach them, and help them with their homework, and take them from place Y to place Z, and all the other myriad of things that a person has to do to maintain a daily life, yes, under the onrush of life, it goes flowing over your head, and still maintain your balance. Maintain your spiritual connection to God, despite the fact that you have all of this stuff pouring over your head. So in Judaism, right, I thought it was a very insightful idea. This rabbi's suggestion was that you don't have to separate yourself from community. You don't have to separate yourself from regular life in order to gain these types of spiritual heights through self-control. Judaism actually says these can be attained, and they should be attained, on the contrary, by immersing yourself as much as possible in the types of mundane affairs which are normally distractions. And a person who can maintain his connection, and is encouraged and is required to maintain that connection as much as possible, despite the fact that he's underneath that waterfall of life, that's going to enable him to attain the type of spiritual greatness that a person needs. Still, it involves a disconnect with the intention of trying to reconnect within those many activities, the belief in God, the awareness of God, and the fact that he's doing everything for the right and proper personal spiritual purpose. In any case, there is this kind of necessary tzimtzum which takes place, this type of reduction which has to take place. Aval yesh yomim yuduim, but there are days, there are times when this type of restriction or constriction does not apply. She'ena gvuras polos, ven b'nei adam tzrichim eleim, and people don't need them either. They don't need their degree of connection to be exercised through these distractions of the regular mundane time. And the reason is for this is because there's a certain appointed times where the Sephira of Keter is operative there. There is a lesser degree of tzimtzum taking place. Or there are times when the quality of the Sephira of Keter is more pervasive. These times, or in these circumstances, it would be more appropriate to use all of the different manifestations of teachings that we learned in the earlier section here regarding Keter. They can't, he said here, be applied for all people at all times during all activities, but there are special times and special circumstances where they can be, and he's going to describe what they are. All of the other attributes which do come and flow forth from Keter certainly have their relevance at their appropriate particular time. But at these other times, it's not appropriate. It's not necessary, not appropriate to use them. And the reason is because the light of the attribute of Keter negates their influence. So if there are times when it's appropriate to act with the midah of Devorah, Din, or Tiferes, or Hod, or whatever the midah might be, during these times it's not required. It's not necessary. And the reason is because they're kind of like overshadowed. There are times when a candle is necessary. There are times when candlelight is more effective for the light that a person needs than daylight. But there are some times when the daylight is so prevalent that the otherwise very productive and specifically relevant light from a candle is overshadowed. It's not necessary. So here too as well, there are times when a person needs a specific form of light and it's used in a specific context. For example, it might be in the context of work or of study or of some other mundane important activity. He needs to take a certain degree of divine energy and, like a flashlight, direct it into that specific activity in a way which is going to be most effective for maintaining, on the one hand, that activity, but also maintaining a connection to godliness while involved in it. But there are other times when that restriction, that kind of constriction is removed, and the person moves into a greater degree of light. That flashlight is no longer going to be, it's not going to be necessary. It's not going to be productive. And therefore, in these times, and he's going to tell us shortly what they are, in these times a person should not use the type of restrictive, compartmentalized attributes that are in Keter, but rather refrain back to the default of the light of Keter. And what are these times? Kagon Shabbos. Like Shabbos, for example. Shabbos is a time to let things go, to refrain from the type of self-control needed to leave spirituality for the purpose of doing what's required in the mundane. Because, of course, naturally, we all would want to float into godliness, leave ourselves to absolve into the greatness of God, right? That's how we would naturally all prefer. We have to exert a great degree of self-control to tear ourselves away from that tremendous love and passion that we have for God in order to be involved in otherwise mundane activities. Maybe I'm being a bit facetious. It's not quite like that, but that's the way it should be. Yeah, more often than not, it's actually the opposite. We have to force ourselves towards godliness because it's much more easy to slip into the mundane material activities of the world. But spiritually speaking, that shouldn't be the case. We really should be so connected that we have to force ourselves, like a lover would be torn away from the one he loves in order to go do something which he has to do, but constantly looking back. That's how we really should look at it. Shabbos is a time to let all of that mundane activity, which has its important, its appropriate time behind, and run back to the object of our complete and utter love. That's God. And Shabbos is that time when we kind of let our spiritual hair down, right? And relax and take it easy, not in a physical sense, but in a spiritual sense. Not feeling the constrictions of the need to work or the constrictions of the need to socialize or the constrictions of the need to produce or whatever the case may be. But rather to let all that go and simply fluidly kind of return back into God and godliness. That's really the way it should be. The truth is, this fits in a bit to the notion of creation that the Kabbalah explains, where that creation is not really a kind of proactive delineation, stage after stage. Day 1, God created X. Day 2, Y. Day 3, Z, and so forth and so on. God created, but rather creation came into being not through God's proactively creating, but actually through God's recessively or consecutively receding, because we spoke, right, that's the notion of Tzimtzum. Because we spoke about how the intensity of God's absolute infinity should preclude the possibility of creation existing. Creation only came into being because God imposed that limitation, as it were, on itself, so that it digressed or receded, creating a space and potential for creation to come into being. So that creation was really not something that God added 1 plus 2 plus 3 but 4, but it's something that came out indirectly through God's receding. Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. So the further God removed, the more creation came into being in the absence. And it's interesting that according to this, then, that mankind was actually created at the furthest step that God took back. Right? So in a way, God and man are like polar opposites. Man is really the expression of God's furthest removal. How do we reconcile that tension? Right? It has to do with free will and the idea that we can become like God. Right? Because, right, when there's only God, there can actually be nothing other than God. Things can only come into existence in the, as it were, absence of God. And the possibility of there being, as it were, another God can only be at the extreme removal of God's presence. And therefore, the most godly-like creature that could exist other than God could only result from the furthest retreat possible, right, from God. And that's why at that point, that creature, that creation is the only one that has free will. It was the removal of God to that extent which enabled human beings to have free will. And that places human beings diametrically opposed now to God. Because human beings with free will can either become like God and challenge God, or human beings can use their free will to discover God. This God that has been hidden. Step after step after step after step, God has been hidden behind the world. God is hiding behind creation. which is why creation actually in Hebrew is called Olam. Olam means hidden. Revealed creation is, interestingly enough, in Hebrew called hiddenness. What's hidden? You have nothing more revealed than creation. What's hidden is God. Right? God is hiding underneath these layers of perception which come into being the result of his regression, and the highest creation and the pinnacle of regression are human beings. Right? And since they're the highest level of divine regression, that gives them the possibility of either being very high or very low. And it all pivots around free will. Right? All pivots around free will. So what is Shabbos? Right? Day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6. And we're told in the Torah, right, that day 7, God rested. Yeah? He rested. But what does it mean he rested? Did he exert some effort for which he needed to rest?
Stop producing.
Very good. He desisted from creating, which according to the explanation really means he desisted from controlling and limiting himself. And therefore what he did was he let himself go, as it were. He let go and let the divine aspect be reintroduced or reinfused into this arena that's been created through his retraction. So Shabbos is the reintroduction of the divine into the realm that came into being despite the divine, as a result of the retraction of the divine. And in a way, it really is a reversion to the state before creation, because let's go back. Day 6, day 5, day 4, day 3, day 2, day 1. What was before day 1?
God.
Or, in terms of days of the week, as it were, Shabbos. Yeah. That state of godliness alone would correspond to the Shabbos before creation. And that's the state which, at least on a smaller scale, after Tzimtzum, came into being on day 7 of creation. It was God's allowing himself, or itself as it were, to revert back to the fluidity of the Shabbos that existed before day 1. Right? And if Jews were just to keep 2 Shabboses, that would bring about the complete rejection. Right? What are these 2 Shabboses? It's using Shabbos to climb back to that ultimate oneness of God. The Shabbos of the 6th, after the 6th day, but it's also the Shabbos before day 1. These are the 2 Shabboses. If we realize, in any case, what am I getting with all this? Is that these times, or Shabbos is a time when, right? Shabbos is a time when there's a greater degree of divine energy, of light coming through Keter, because there is an absence of Tzimtzum. On Shabbos, God is desisting from controlling himself, from limiting himself. You can think about, maybe with an analogy, if you have a river which flows, it has within it great potential, energy within it. If you want to harness that energy productively, right, you do so by building a dam, but you can only build the dam if you restrict the flow. So as you're constructing the dam, you actually have to limit or redirect or hold back that flow until the dam is placed. Once the dam is in place, then you let the flow go through this kind of matrix of the dam that's been created, and now you can harness that energy productively. So that's kind of what we're talking about here as well. The divine, before creation, has within it great energy, great potential. In order for that to be harnessed within creation, it has to be limited, held back. As it's held back, the more it's held back, the more you're able to construct the structure that it's intended to flow through. And once that structure has been completed, you let the flow go through, and now that energy can be harnessed productively. So those are the 6 days of creation. That was the withdrawal of God in order for that energy in order for the system to come into place through which the divine energy could then be directed in order for creation to be brought about productively. So that's Shabbos. Shabbos is therefore a time of letting that flow go, even if it's also ultimately reduced, but it's reduced to much less extent than it is during the 6 days of creation. It's much closer to a reversal of the primordial Shabbos before creation, if not entirely, at least partially like that. And therefore, that's a time when greater divine light is present. And it's not a time, therefore, when a person should be working. Because working to earn a living is tzimtzum. The productive activities that we do are tzimtzum. It's differentiation. It's productive, it's kind of creation. And that should not exist on Shabbos. Shabbos is a time when we don't have tzimtzum. We don't have the different activities which result from tzimtzum. But actually, it's a time which is infused with this kind of fluid oneness of God before creation. So on Shabbos, therefore, this is one of the times when we do not apply the types of constrictive attributes which are needed for the mundane, finite world of creation. Rather, we bask in the glory of God, the oneness before creation. Page Lamed Vav at the very bottom, last line. Kagon Shabbos sheha'olam mistaken b'tzoid oineg ve'ein danin b'Shabbos. And the world is actually corrected and perfected through the mystery involving the joy and the pleasure of Shabbos. The physical joys that we have on Shabbos are only intended to kind of be manifestations of the more spiritual joys that we're supposed to be experiencing and delighting with on Shabbos. Az yishtamesh b'midos elu kulan. Then it would be appropriate to use these different manifestations of the Keter that we spoke about before, where a person is immersed in total purity and honesty and integrity and humility. Kidei liftoyach hamakoros ha'elyonim. And all of this is in order to open up the sources of blessing which are on high. Like using that dam analogy I spoke about, to open up those floodgates which come into the world through Shabbos. And the way a person observes Shabbos, more importantly, the way a person feels and thinks, the spiritual activities that a person does on Shabbos, the more he's actually opening up these floodgates of blessing into his life, into the world, for the entire week. So that Shabbos, and this is one of the reasons, this is one of the explanations for why we refer to Shabbos as right, the Makora Bracha. Shabbos is the source of blessing into the world. If a person were to think, contemplate the different lights of the sphere of Keter during his prayer, for example, on Shabbos, but he does with his activities, with his actions, something other than that, meaning he's connecting into the undifferentiated level of the divine in Keter during his prayer, but he were to be involved in mundane activities on Shabbos itself, then that would result in attention. How will be able to open up this source of blessing? He's literally pushing off any blessing that could, any gate of blessing that might be open through his spiritual endeavors. He's actually closing that gate and impeding any of the blessing by the activities that he's doing. This matter could be understood through what's called a kal vachomer, all the more so. Im hasfiros elyonos magbiros hadinim hakedoshim ve'kaas hakadosh. If something as ethereal, something as spiritual as the spheros, which in their state of tzimtzum limit the light of Keter, despite the fact that they're very spiritual, they're very ethereal, nevertheless, in the context of what he's been discussing until now, these spheros limit the light that's coming out from Keter, because you see, for example, blue or green in the analogy, and not white. You're seeing a restriction of that light. So all the more so, lo yishra Keter behen, if a person were to, for example, act in ways that have to do with the midah of Devorah, like anger, even if it's an expression of anger which is for the purpose of heaven, and therefore it has a certain quality of mitzvah, all the more so, that activity, that action, that behavior is going to occlude the light from Keter. If the spheros of tzimtzum limit the light from Keter, all the more so activities of tzimtzum are going to limit that light. And therefore, it's very important when the Torah says you may not light. You shall not ignite light in your homes on Shabbos. The Gemara explains, not only shall you not light physical light, but you shall not ignite the fire of animosity, hatred, tension, arguments on Shabbos. Right? Why? Because even more than the action, that behavior is going to include the light that would naturally flow into the world through Shabbos. Uma gam shehu ba le'orero al hamidos helyonos vehen omros kama ozus panim yeshbo ein or keser mizgale bonu v'pnei dinenu hakadosh v'hator v'rotze legalosoi malekas v'pulois megunois chitzonos. If he acts in this way on Shabbos, angry, in a way which is, like I said, confrontational, he doesn't act in a peaceful, fluid, calm, pleasant way. So these other attributes say, as it were, how chutzpahdik is this person? As a result of his activity, he's actually preventing the light of Keter from coming down anyway through the spheros. Because of these judgments that he's causing to become illuminated, even if he's doing it for good reasons, what he thinks to be good reasons. And he's actually causing any energy that would go from Keter into the lower spheros to be radiated into the world on Shabbos in a negative, harmful way. So that if normally there is room for din in worldly, mundane affairs, they're not appropriate on Shabbos. And if he acts in this way, he's actually causing the light of Keter to be diminished and sent into the world through these lower spheros. And that's actually going to have a harmful effect when they really shouldn't be illuminated that way. This would be one example where, despite the fact that normally a person cannot act truly and fully according to the attribute of Keter, Shabbos he certainly can and he should, and if he doesn't, he's harming things. Okay, so let's stop here and we'll try and continue. Tomorrow. He's going to show that the same thing applies with Torah study as well. So that we'll see that there's a correlation between everything we said about Shabbos and its unworldliness and Torah, as it were, and its unworldliness as well.